Our speaker is Grant Sizemore. He has degrees in Zoology and Environmental Science from Miami University in Ohio, and a master's degree in Wildlife Ecology and Conservation from the University of Florida. He's been working in conservation research and education and policy for 15 years, and he's a certified wildlife biologist and currently the director of invasive species programs at the American Bird Conservancy, where he runs the Cats Indoors program. So that is our topic for tonight, domestic cat management in Mendocino County. And with that, I will turn it over to Grant. Thanks very much.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm happy to be here. I want to say thank you to the Mendocino Coast Audubon Society for the opportunity to chat with you all this evening. So we're going to talk about everybody's favorite subject, domestic cats, right? Yeah, there are, as was mentioned, there are some deeply held beliefs and emotions that come up when talking about domestic cat control or management. But we're going to kind of lay all that a little bit aside for now and go into a lot of the science associated with cats and their impacts in the environment and what the management challenges and opportunities might be, especially in Mendocino County. So let's jump in. First, I think it's always important to understand where you're getting your information. And so I want to just introduce American Bird Conservancy real quickly for those of you who don't know who we are. We are a 501c3 conservation nonprofit dedicated to the conservation of native birds and their habitats throughout the Americas. We've been around since 1994. The organization was founded. And have really been growing leaps and bounds, especially over the last 5 years. And we are tackling lots of new challenges all across the hemisphere. If you'd like to learn more, there's a screenshot of our website. It's abcbirds.org. Feel free to check it out. But we are a science-based nonprofit. And so we really, we follow the science on what is needed to conserve birds and their habitats. And we structure our work using this pyramid. And so you can see at the very top of that pyramid is endangered birds. And so that is really our priority to conserve endangered birds, prevent any future extinctions. And then moving down the pyramid, we tackle birds of conservation concern and then threats to all birds, and then building conservation capacity with our partners, with government, with the public. And we have a variety of different ways in which we go about achieving these bird conservation results. My work tends to fall, well, it really goes throughout the pyramid, but most broadly, it's within the threats to all birds. And we have a variety of programs dedicated to tackling threats to all birds, like collisions with building windows, pesticides, fisheries bycatch, that sort of thing. But Cats Indoors is the name of the program that I run. I've been working on the Cats Indoors program for almost 10 years now. And it is dedicated to achieving conservation results through responsible cat ownership and effective cat management. And just so you don't think I am biased in any way against cats, this is a photo of me with my cat, Amelia Bedelia. Okay, so let's make sure we're all on the same page here with regard to how we're using some terminology. Because a lot of terms are used by a variety of folks in different outlets, and they can mean different things based on, who's speaking. So when I'm speaking tonight, I will say domestic cat. That refers to all individuals of the species Felis catus. And then a subset of domestic cat is the free-ranging cat, also known as a free-roaming cat or an at-large cat. That's any cat really that has outdoor access in an unconstrained way. So it has the ability to roam the landscape. A stray cat then is a subset of a free-ranging cat. That's a cat that is usually habituated to people. So it might have been lost or been abandoned and now is roaming the environment. And then a feral cat is one that is generally not habituated to people, tends to be a rather wild animal. Feral, of course, means a domestic species that has returned to a wild state. So these, I want to just point out the differences here. You know, the domestic cat or Felis catus, that is a biological designation. The other three are really behavioral designations. And so a free-ranging cat, a stray cat, a feral cat, these are all domestic cats. These are just, like I said, behavioral designations. Based on the behavior of that individual cat, we might refer to them differently, but they are all the same species. So, and I want to give you the theme of the talk kind of right up here at the outset, because although cats, domestic cats can make wonderful pets, I showed you my pet cat already, they can have significant impacts in the environment when they are allowed to roam outdoors. And as a result of that, management of domestic cats on the landscape is absolutely critical. So I hope you'll take that message away from this talk today. If you get nothing else, hopefully you come away thinking that this is in fact a true statement, and then my job will be done. But I want to start the conversation by talking about invasive species. And you know, I think we really need to ask ourselves, what is an invasive species? And many of you probably already know what an invasive species. You may recognize some of the invasive species on the bottom of the slide here, which can be found in California. There is a federal designation for the term invasive species, which was established in Executive Order 13112 in 1999. It is an alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. And so I want you to think a little bit about that definition as we move through the talk, and just ask yourself, is a domestic cat an invasive species? So, domestic cats were domesticated about 10,000 years ago in what's called the Near East, or sort of North Africa, Middle East region. Their nearest ancestor is the Near Eastern wildcat, as you can see in this cladogram here on the left. And since their domestication, they have since spread across the globe because of their close affiliation with people. It's not really clear exactly how they were domesticated. It's possible they sort of domesticated themselves and people sort of allowed it. It's also possible that we sort of encouraged it. But whatever the case may be, since their domestication and their relationship bonded with humans, we have taken them all across the globe. And from the Middle East, you can see now they have spread everywhere. This is, they're on every continent except Antarctica. The continents aren't represented here. This study was looking at islands, and you can see, you know, islands across the globe have now had cats, domestic cats, introduced to them. And there's, you know, something unique about domestic cats. They're a predator, of course, as probably all of us know. They are an obligate carnivore, so that means they have to eat meat. They are not, you know, like dogs are omnivores. Cats are not. They're obligate carnivores, and they are instinctive predators. So they will hunt regardless of whether or not they may be hungry at the moment. And I think, you know, this is pretty intuitive, although we don't necessarily think about it all the time. But for any of us who have interacted with a pet cat, like with a feather toy, like in this picture here on the right, or a laser pointer, or, you know, ball of string, whatever, we are eliciting a predatory response through that play behavior with that cat. And when we do it inside the house, you know, it's fun. It's stimulating for our cat. You know, it's an athletic experience for them, so they get a little exercise. But then at the end of the play behavior, you know, they understand they're not going to eat that feather toy, or they're not going to necessarily eat the laser pointer, you know, the ball of light. But when that same behavior moves outside of the house and is occurring in the environment, then all of a sudden it becomes deadly for wildlife. And so one of the things that we see is that not only are cats killing wildlife because of this instinctive predatory drive and not related to hunger, but they often kill a lot of animals and leave them where they kill them. They have absolutely nothing to do with them in terms of consumption. And this was identified through Lloyd et al. 2013, and you see some images from that study here on the left. It was called the Kitty Cam study. And so in partnership with National Geographic, the researchers from University of Georgia got volunteers of owned cats, put some little collars, cameras on collars of cats, then let them roam outside as they already did. These were well-fed cats, and they observed the results. And it wasn't terribly surprising to see that cats killed wildlife. We know that cats kill wildlife. We know that even well-fed cats kill wildlife. What was surprising about this study was the quantity of wild animals that were killed and not returned to the home. So many previous studies had relied on prey returns to estimate the total impact that cats have in their environment. And what this study found was that only about 23% of all prey were actually returned to the home. So any prey return studies, you actually need to multiply by about 4 to 5 times to get a true indicator of the total number of animals that are actually impacted by cats roaming the landscape. So for any individual who says, oh, well, my cat only kills, 1 or 2 animals a year, you need to multiply that out a bit. And I want to talk about this from an individual perspective. Too frequently in conservation science, we deal with populations of animals. But in the animal welfare world, where cats are most frequently managed, they often think about individuals, and it sets a really unfair playing field. And I think we need to talk a little bit more about the individual wild animals that are impacted by cats. You can see this image from the Wildlife Center of Virginia on the left, the faces of cat attacks. These are the individual animals that are impacted by cats. And although we don't cuddle up with them at night necessarily, they don't sleep at the end of our bed, these are living wild animals that have a right to existence and are impacted on a very personal level, as you can see in these images in the middle of the screen. Often brutal deaths because of cats that are roaming the landscape, free roaming cats. So Lloyd et al. 2017 did a study of cat-caused intakes at wildlife rehabilitation facilities across the country. They got data from 82 rehab centers, and what they found was that 68% of all cat-related admissions died. 78% of adult birds died. And this is with cutting edge, professional veterinary care. This isn't just, some person's cat attacks something, you see it and you're like, oh, well, that sucks. No, this is an animal that was taken to a veterinary clinic, provided proper care, but because of the nature of cat attacks, of the bite wounds or scratches, they are often deadly for birds and other wildlife. And you probably know that cats have a great deal of bacteria in their mouths. And so these birds, as soon as they are, cat teeth are very sharp, if they puncture down into the flesh, it transports that bacteria and can frequently cause sepsis. And so the bird or other animal will end up dying as a result of that, even if they don't die from the initial attack itself. In Lloyd et al. 2017, you can see this quote here from the paper. Their wildlife rehab data, they said, quote, raises awareness of the preventable suffering of individual animals. And I think that's really one of the key points that I think is worth mentioning, is this is entirely preventable. Domestic cats are not wildlife. They do not necessarily need to be roaming outdoors. And so these deaths are something we can prevent, and I would argue have a duty to prevent. Certainly if we want to conserve wild animals, whether that be species or populations or individuals that call our natural areas home. So one of the local wildlife rehab facilities is Native Songbird Care and Conservation. I just want to point out that they report on their website that cats are the top cause of songbird intake at their facility and do advise keeping cats contained as a result of that. Okay, so I'm going to show a brief video here, again, focusing on the individual animal and their experience. We produced a short film called Surviving the Wild Cats and Birds, which looked at the experiences of wildlife rehabilitators as they seek to treat some of these victims of cat attacks at their facilities. So let's take a look at that.
Not about keeping your cat happy, it's about keeping the native wildlife healthy. And our domestic cats are not part of this native wildlife. So it can be frustrating. This morning, we checked in the yellow-billed cuckoo that was caught by a cat. And that one wasn't as fortunate as a titmouse. The cat did severe damage. There were bite wounds on the back. And he had some spinal trauma where I didn't feel the spine was fractured, but there was definitely no use of the legs whatsoever and no feeling back there. So that was an unfortunate euthanasia. We try everything we can before euthanasia. We throw the kitchen sink in. It's always our last resort, but it's everything we do is in the best interest of the animal. Having a small prayer to say just makes me feel more set in my place that I'm doing the right thing. Grant this soul swift passage to your garden and forgive me my need that places it there.
Well, unfortunately, cats have contributed to the extinction of 63 species worldwide. Even well-fed cats will hunt and kill.
We received in a fledgling cardinal, which is a juvenile, just about ready to leave the nest. He was attacked by a cat. The owner of the cat there might be a small puncture right down over here. As long as there's no bacteria. They're my babies. You try not to get attached to the patients, but you're hand rearing these little ones. You're feeding them every 20 minutes. You do get attached to them, and then you send them up to second chance where they get acclimated to the outside, and then they're released, and it's like a proud mama moment. He was released. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So hopefully you got to see a little bit more about what wildlife rehabbers do and some of their experiences treating the individuals that have been impacted by cats running at large. So I want to show another quick video here that talks about how the predation pressure on native wildlife by domestic cats is different from native predators. And there was a really cool study done out of North Carolina State University several years ago that goes into details about how, well, I'll let them tell you all about it, actually. I hope I will. Well, maybe I won't. Okay, so that's all right. I can tell you about it. I don't know why it's not working. It did just a few minutes ago. So basically what they did was they put GPS collars on domestic cats from around the world and identified where they go and also used cameras to identify what they were killing. And what they found was that these owned cats weren't traveling a super great distance, although some individuals did. But they were killing, I believe it was 2 to 5 times the number of animals in their area of a similar size native predator. And I think they were comparing it to the jungle cat as their standard. But one of the interesting things they found was that as opposed to the native predator, in this case, the jungle cat, which occupies a huge range in order to complete its dietary needs, the domestic cat has such a high density of predators in a given area that the total predation pressure in that given area was actually 4 to 10 times greater than that of a native predator. So domestic cats have an outsized impact in their local environment. And these numbers have added up. There have been a handful of studies that have tried to estimate the total number of different taxa of wildlife killed by domestic cats around the world. And you can see the results of those studies here, notably in the United States, which was the first country to look at cat-caused bird and mammal mortality annually. The estimate is 2.4 billion birds are killed in this country every year. I mean, it's a staggering number, truly. And 12.3 billion mammals, which is, I know it's not necessarily the focus of American Bird Conservancy or Mendocino Coast Audubon Society, but it is a truly tremendous number of wild animals that are killed every single year by domestic cats. And it's not because any one cat necessarily kills, 1,000 individuals per year, although that's certainly possible. It's because there are so many domestic cats roaming the landscape that the combined impact, the cumulative impact of all of those individual predators contributes to this large number that we see here, 2.4 billion birds in the United States every year. And you can see it's consistent with numbers from other countries. Basically, every country that has looked at this has found at least hundreds of millions of animals killed by cats roaming the landscape every year. And these numbers have a big impact in conservation. You are probably familiar with the 3 billion bird study, as it's sort of commonly called, Rosenberg et al., I think 2019, which found that in the last 50 years, the United States and Canada have lost about 2.9 billion birds. Basically the only group of birds that's doing well is waterfowl. And cats have an outsized impact. They are the #1 source of direct human-caused mortality to birds, both in the United States and Canada, where those types of studies have been completed. And you can see that in the graph on the right. Cats are so much higher than all of the other direct human-caused sources of bird mortality. And the consequence is that now, birds need conservation action. Most birds are declining, like I've said, and 1/3 of all North American bird species are in need of urgent conservation action. And we've seen trends like this among all wildlife populations, according to this World Wildlife Fund headline. Populations of wildlife have fallen nearly 70% in 50 years. Certainly, we have seen declines in wild populations of animals, and cats have contributed a great deal to this. I mentioned, you probably heard in the video, the Wildlife Rehabber video, that domestic cats have contributed to the extinction of 63 species. This is research that looked at that. This is Darty et al. 2016. And they found that domestic cats have contributed to the extinction of 63 species, which includes 40 birds, 21 mammals, and 2 reptiles. And you can see in this graph, BMR, by the way, represents birds, mammals, reptiles. Red bars are extinct species, gray bars are species threatened with extinction. And in total, I think cats they accounted for 26% of all birds, mammal, and reptile species extinctions caused by invasive species. 430 species of threatened and endangered birds, mammals, or reptiles have been impacted by cats. So, this is probably most acutely illustrated through the Stevens Island wren example, which some of you might be familiar with. The Stevens Island wren, or Lyle's wren, was found on Stevens Island in New Zealand in approximately 1890. A lighthouse keeper brought his cat, and maybe another cat, or it was pregnant, it's unclear, to the island, and he let it roam free. At that time, the cat brought home in its mouth a small bird that was at that time unknown to Western science. He ended up sending it off, and it was identified as what we now call the Stevens Island wren. But in a matter of just a few years, that species had gone from being identified by science to being wiped out by that lighthouse keeper's cat and its offspring. A really sad example of the very swift impact that cats can have in the environment. Now, in addition to direct predation, domestic cats roaming the landscape can also modify behaviors and alter ecosystems. And so in this example on the top left, Crooks and Soule, 1999, this was research done in California. They found that habitat fragmentation also contributed to the differential impacts of cats in the environment. And so what they observed was that in intact natural habitats, there were more coyotes, which decreased the number of domestic cats, which then increased the number of songbirds, especially ground nesting birds. But in habitats that had undergone significant degradation or fragmentation, that coyotes were not present, and therefore you had more domestic cats, which then ultimately led to fewer songbirds in the habitat. In this graph in the middle, what we find is that the presence of domestic cats can also alter the community of species in a given area. And what that research found, this was also done in California, in Hawkins et al. 2004, that in the presence of domestic cats, the number of native rodents declined considerably, but non-native rodents actually did incredibly well in the presence of domestic cats. And so it modified the makeup of the species that were present in the environment. And you can see also for birds, when cats were present, predictably fewer birds were present at that time. Now, finally, Bonington et al. 2013 found that the mere presence of a domestic cat in the environment can significantly alter the reproductive capacity of songbirds. So they used a model of a cat. This was research done in the UK, a model of a cat, and they put that model of a cat near a common blackbird nest for a period of, I believe it was 15 minutes. And then they pulled it away and monitored the results, the behavior of the common blackbirds in the nest. And what they found was a reduction in the amount of feeding of chicks in the nest by 1/3, and actually an increase in the predation by another predator of that nest by an order of magnitude, because it changes the behavior of the adults who are feeding the chicks, trying to raise their young. Suddenly they have to be involved in anti-predatory response because of the presence of domestic cat, even though in this case, clearly a model of a domestic cat doesn't pose a threat at all and isn't actually attempting to kill those young in the nest. So real quickly, in review, domestic cats are an introduced species in North America. Like I said, they originated in the Middle East and then were spread around the globe by people. And domestic cats are instinctive predators that can significantly and negatively impact birds and other wildlife populations. So let's move away from predation or the role of domestic cats in the environment as a predator and talk a little bit about their role in the transmission of diseases. I'm going to focus mostly on zoonotic diseases, on diseases that impact people, but some of this applies to wildlife as well. And I will talk a little bit about that. So this graph or table actually summarizes many of the domestic cat transmitted parasites and diseases And I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I will talk briefly about 3 of them. That's rabies, typhus, and toxoplasmosis. So rabies. Domestic cats are the top carrier of rabies among domestic animals in the United States. So, you probably think of Old Yeller when you think of rabies. I know I do, but that's really an antiquated idea. We've done a really good job with dog control in this country. And as a result, the prevalence of rabid dogs in the United States has dropped significantly. And at this point, cats are about 4 times more commonly confirmed rabid across the United States than dogs are. But as you can see in this map from a study that was published in 2016, most of the rabid cats are concentrated in the eastern United States, although some of it does occur in central and western United States, and there you can see a few dots there in California. Now, looking at California in particular, this is data pulled from 1991 through 2020. And you can see the breakdown between dogs and cats. It's actually a little more equal among dogs and cats in California as it is to other states in the United States. Cats slightly outpace dogs. I think it's 49 confirmed cases of rabid cats versus 47 cases for dogs. But together they make up 72% of all rabid domestic animals during this time frame. Cattle were about 21% and account for most of the rest. Mendocino County actually has had 15 rabid cats from 1950 to 2021. That's the 5th highest county for rabid cats in the state. The most recent case was in 2015 in the Fort Bragg area. I'll talk briefly about typhus. And if you're not familiar with typhus, it is transmitted by fleas. Symptoms of typhus in people can include fever, chills, aches, nausea, stomach pain, coughing, rash. It's not usually severe. It can be, but it's pretty rare. But the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, advises not feeding or petting stray animals, including cats, because of the potential for infection with typhus. And so this bacteria can be transmitted via the cat flea, which, as you can guess, can exist on cats. And then from there, it can be transmitted to people, and then the bite of a flea can result in the transmission of typhus. So cats aren't giving us typhus directly. They are transmitting the vector of typhus, the flea, to us. And so there have been some cases of typhus in California. You see this warning, protect yourself and your pets. That was put out by Orange County Vector Control, who actually also sent a letter in 2015 to Disneyland, where they warned Disneyland about typhus. There had been a case of typhus associated with cat colonies that had been documented, and there were human infections that had occurred associated with these cats being maintained on Disneyland property. So moving on from typhus, we're going to spend a little time on toxoplasmosis because I think it's just such a fascinating disease, and hopefully you will too. So toxoplasmosis is a disease caused by the parasite Toxoplasma gondii. It relies on felines to complete its life cycle. It can only sexually reproduce in the gut of a feline. And I'm saying feline here because it's not just domestic cats. It can also include a bobcat, a mountain lion, a tiger, a lion, whatever. So all felines. But domestic cats are included in that. And the mechanism, which is probably too far in the weeds for this conversation, but I think it's interesting, is there's an enzyme that's lacking in felines, which allows for the right conditions, which triggers the sexual reproduction and subsequent formation of what's called an oocyst, which is like the egg. And so as you can see on the right, which takes us through the life stages of Toxoplasma gondii, once a cat hosts Toxoplasma gondii, it reproduces inside the cat. that cat then excretes oocysts into the environment, where they can remain infectious for months to years in soil and saltwater and freshwater, and then can subsequently infect any warm-blooded species. So any bird or mammal that accidentally ingests or inhales one of these oocysts can get infected with Toxoplasma gondii and subsequently get toxoplasmosis, the disease caused by the infection. So people can get it from a variety of sources. One, we can directly interact with the oocyst. Two, we can get it by eating another animal that has been infected. So we eat a pig, for example, that had toxoplasmosis and its tissues were infected. And then we eat those infected tissues without killing the oocyst. We can then become infected. We can get it through mother to fetus transmission. We can also get it through, like organ transplant. That's pretty rare. So those are the main ways of acquiring toxoplasmosis in people. One of the things I want to point out about toxoplasmosis is it is a zombie parasite. Interestingly, it was discovered in 2000 that it changes the way that rodents, in this case rats, perceive the environment. They are actually stimulated by the presence of cats. In the study, they used cat urine, and they found that the rodents were sort of sexually attracted to the cat urine as a result of being infected with Toxoplasma gondii. So it changes the behavior of the host, and it's thought that then this, for rodents, increases the likelihood that they will interact with a cat to their own peril, thus completing the life cycle of the parasite, allowing it to get back into a cat and then sexually reproduce. So that same host modifying behavior can occur in other animals, not just rodents. It can occur in people, and there have been studies that have looked at such as this Flegler et al., or just Flegler actually, and I forget the year, but how and why toxoplasma makes us crazy. It does change the way we behave in some ways. There are certainly correlations with that. Other symptoms or consequences of infection can include blindness, memory loss, organ failure, miscarriage. It's actually the reason that OBGYNs let pregnant women know that they should not be changing cat litter. So if you've ever heard that, or you have a partner who's ever heard that, that's because of the risk of toxoplasmosis. And then there are, like I mentioned, the changes in behavior. Schizophrenia is there's a correlation between schizophrenia and toxoplasma infection. It's not quite clear what the cause and effect is in that case, but there is a correlation. And overall, this, I think, is a public health problem. And certainly Torrey and Yolkin in 2013 made that argument as well. And I want to point out that this Teich et al. 2018 study, I think, brings it home the concern associated with environmental contamination. These domestic cats roaming the environment and then excreting Toxoplasma oocysts and those remaining infectious for months to years. When those domestic cats are in and around areas that people frequent, especially at-risk individuals, then that creates a public health problem. And so this 2018 study found that 82% of cats trapped in Richmond City in Virginia were within roaming distance of public elementary or preschool grounds, public parks, or community gardens. And for anybody who's been around kids, for example, they put a lot of things in their mouths. They're testing it out. And that's why this image of a kid in a sandbox has been included, because sandboxes have actually been identified as a risk factor for transmission. If you have a sandbox, you need to keep it covered, because otherwise, it mimics cat litter, basically. And so cats will use it to defecate. It is also an agricultural concern, which can be an issue not just for the agricultural animals, the livestock themselves, but also downstream effects Toxoplasmosis is actually the leading cause of death among people from foodborne illnesses in the United States. And a variety of different animals, like I said, all birds and mammals can become infected. Pigs, goats, and sheep are particularly vulnerable to that infection themselves. Plus, they can transmit it to people if we consume the infected tissues that are not killed. And I want to point out that the economic costs are likely in the tens of millions of dollars annually. And also, even when you avoid eating meat, you can't necessarily avoid the environmental contamination or the contamination of food from domestic cats or other felids roaming the environment, defecating and contributing Toxoplasma gondii oocysts. This study by Lilly and Webster from 2021 found that of a variety of produce that were collected from commercial stores, grocery stores, as well as farmers markets, were contaminated with Toxoplasma gondii oocysts on them. And then finally, I'll mention wildlife impacts briefly. I think it's another example of the scale of environmental contamination. This image, excuse me, this image on the left is from research done in California, where they found that domestic cats as well as bobcats and mountain lions were excreting Toxoplasma gondii oocysts in the uplands that were then flowing through the watershed, going into the nearshore marine environment, especially during large rainfall events. And that was ultimately infecting southern sea otters, killing them, modifying their behavior, which then also contributed to their direct mortality. This same sort of terrestrial to marine environment flow of Toxoplasma gondii has been observed in Hawaii, where domestic cats are the only feline species present, and toxo is present as a result of their roaming on the landscape, and it has become a major conservation challenge for the endangered Hawaiian monk seal. I'll also point out that this image of white-tailed deer, there was a study in Ohio that found that about 50%, slightly over 50% of white-tailed deer in the urban-suburban environment were infected with Toxoplasma gondii, which, this is, again, an herbivore that is not interacting directly with cats, but because of the scale of landscape contamination by cat feces, they can then become infected. And this is an issue not just for the individual deer, but also for anybody who's hunting and then consuming deer. They could potentially become infected as well. Okay, so let's move on a little bit. Quick review here. Domestic cats can transmit a wide variety of infectious pathogens, including the ones that we've already talked about, and especially Toxoplasma gondii, which I think is an overlooked disease. It's actually listed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to be among the top 5 neglected parasitic diseases in the United States. And I think we have a lot more work to do to understand it, but clearly what we know so far is troubling. So I want to harken back here to the point I raised at the beginning. What is an invasive species? And, given everything that we've heard so far, I want you to think about, are domestic cats an invasive species? And I slipped up earlier and I mentioned invasive species when I was talking. And so I'm clearly going to make the point. I think domestic cats are an invasive species. And if you agree, you would be in good standing. There are a variety of conservation and political organizations that have also come to the same conclusion. Most notably, I think, by the Western Governors Association, they were listed among the top 25 most harmful terrestrial invasive species in the Western United States. They can be found in our national parks. There was recent news about Poland classifying domestic cats as an invasive species. Maybe you saw it. But I think we need to do more to think about domestic cats as an invasive species. It doesn't take anything away from their, the bond that we have with them, with our pet cats. But once they become free roaming animals, then they have impacts in the environment, and they become or function as an invasive species, an invasive predator in many cases. So going back to our theme here, I think hopefully we've shown that domestic cats have significant impacts in the environment, and that domestic cat management is essential. And it's that management that I want to talk about for the rest of the talk. So I want to think about management from a One Health perspective. We talked about disease transmission. It goes beyond that One Health concept, but basically it's the idea that domestic animal, wild animal, and human health are all interconnected. And I think we need to be looking at management options that consider the full scope of domestic cat impacts, not just whether or not something is effective, but how it will impact the rest of the environment as well. And so if we want to talk about reducing free-roaming cat populations, we need to think about it in terms of population dynamics. And of course, to do that, you must have fewer births and immigration than you have deaths and emigration. But in addition to just finding a management tool that can achieve that, and that's no small task, we also want to think about how that's achieved. Are cats actually maintained in the outdoors, or are they removed from the outdoors or maintained inside an enclosure and in a confined space? Because when cats are maintained outdoors, of course, all of those issues that were identified previously, predation or modified behaviors or disease transmission, still are going to occur for the duration of that individual cat's lifespan. And so I want to talk very briefly about an idea for cat management that has been brought up by certain organizations. You may have heard of it. It's called trap, neuter, release, which involves trapping domestic cats that are on the landscape, so free roaming cats, sterilizing them, either neutering for males or spaying for females, and then releasing, returning, or re-abandoning those animals back onto the landscape. Just overwhelmingly, the science indicates that it does not work reliably to reduce cat populations. Here are some of the studies that have looked at it. And like I said, even if it did reduce cat populations, which it does not, and you know, even with a whole lot of resources and long time periods, it does not reliably reduce cat populations on any meaningful scale. Even if it did, like I said, those cats would be continuing to roam freely across the landscape, impacting birds and other wildlife, as well as contributing to disease issues. And when it comes to diseases, you know, there are some pretty clear guidelines from public health organizations about how we minimize the impacts of certain diseases like rabies, for example. The National Association of State Public Health Veterinarians puts out the Compendium of Animal Rabies Prevention. It's a really long name, but basically what they put out is here in this highlighted text: stray dogs, cats, and ferrets should be removed from the community, and we should keep cats off the landscape. They also say in their 2016 guidelines that all dogs, cats, and ferrets should be vaccinated against rabies and revaccinated in accordance with recommendations in this compendium. And I think this is a very important point, that any management of domestic cats that should occur, if we're going to minimize rabies exposure risks, a cat cannot just be vaccinated once, tossed back out onto the landscape, and then everything's hunky-dory. No, that cat, in order to protect the individual cat as well as the community around it, including wildlife and people, has to be vaccinated once, again after 1 year, and then again every 1 to 3 years, depending on vaccine manufacturer recommendations. And this idea is also consistent with toxoplasmosis, or it parallels toxoplasmosis and its risk factors. This Aguirre et al. 2019 study, which was looking at toxoplasmosis through the lens of One Health, found that management policies that remove cats from ecosystems reduce environmental transmission risks of toxo by eliminating the interaction of definitive and intermediate hosts. So definitive being felines, intermediate being all birds and mammals. Conversely, policies that intentionally maintain unowned and feral domestic cats on the landscape facilitate and may increase the risk of disease transmission. So how we manage these cats matters. So what are the solutions? So from American Bird Conservancy's perspective, it's time to treat cats like we treat dogs. You know, we used to have rabies problems with dogs. We used to have packs of free-roaming cats running the landscape, of free-roaming dogs running the landscape. We do not, for the most part, have that anymore in this country because we've enacted common sense, responsible dog laws. And we do not yet have that with cats. But I think we are moving in the right direction. This New York Times article said, yes, you should walk your cat on a leash. You know, I'm seeing more and more people doing that with leashes, with strollers, building catios, an outside cat catio, which can be as small, you know, it can just be a screen and porch, or it can be incredibly elaborate. Lots of people go crazy with that stuff. But I want to recognize that the AVMA, the Association of Veterinary Medical, the American Veterinary Medical Association, there we go, states that, you know, for the benefit of cats as well as wildlife and people, cats should not be roaming the landscape. Okay, I'm going to show you a very brief video here of why this is also better for cats. Hopefully this will work out, because the other one actually didn't work. Well, it doesn't look like it's going to work, but I think you can get an idea from the still what's going on. So this is a pet cat that is free roaming. This is in Texas, but this happens all the time in California. And then a coyote observes it, sees it as dinner, and then attacks it. The cat in this example does get away. It climbs one of those poles and gets out of the reach of the coyote, who then eventually scampers off. But it's a very dangerous place for cats that are roaming outdoors. And there has been a great deal of research on cats and coyote interactions. You know, research in 2022 by Davenport et al. Found that similar spatial use, sort of green spaces basically, by cats and coyotes led to conflicts and what they called, quote, a high percentage of cat depredation events in Culver City, California. These cats are also missing not just coyotes when they're kept indoors, but when they're indoors, they miss a whole variety of other risks to them, which are laid out in this Twitter post by a couple of social media cat stars, Cole and Marmalade. And you see it's, you know, being hit by a car, being abused, succumbing to the elements, things like that. And I also want to mention Chalkowski et al. 2019 study found that outdoor cats are about 3 times more likely to be infected with parasites than indoor-only cats. So the cats themselves are really at risk when they're roaming outdoors. It's time to treat cats like we treat dogs, not just through the individual management actions, but also in raising the level of care and responsibility we have for pet cats. So when it comes to unowned cats on the landscape, American Bird Conservancy recommends these management activities occur. You trap those cats, and then ideally you adopt them out, rehabilitate them, maybe place them in a long-term holding facility. If all other options are unavailable, then euthanasia becomes the choice of last resort, but it is a choice that's on the table. But under no circumstances should we ever re-abandon cats back to the landscape. Okay, I'm going to talk real briefly about the legal aspects here. Obviously, this is a lot of information on the screen. I'm not going to go through all of it. But these lay out some of the California state code associated with domestic cat management and control. So I want to just say, basically, you know, animal cruelty is prohibited, animal abandonment is prohibited. Licensing for cats is authorized but not required. Sterilization is only required for cats coming from an adoption facility. And there is a policy, although it's unclear how it's implemented, that California try to adopt or treat animals rather than euthanize them. Now, moving on to Mendocino County, you know, county code mirrors some of this. It's basically overall in the county and in the city, cruelty is prohibited, abandonment is prohibited. Cats can become a public nuisance, and that's laid out in how they could be that. But what's really missing in these local ordinances is a mandatory rabies vaccination requirement, a licensing requirement, a microchip requirement, which provides long-term permanent identification, a running at large prohibition, keeping cats on an owner's property, and a sterilization requirement, with some exception, of course. And so I want to just show you an image of how licensing can be effective Los Angeles County actually is the #1 county in California for cat rabies. It used to have a whole lot of rabid cats. And then a licensing ordinance went into effect in 1946. There's some ambiguity about the exact year, but I think it was about 1946. And you can see the impact that that had on the number of rabid cats. You know, it was huge before that, and immediately started to drop off as people licensed their cats, and associated with that licensing was a rabies vaccine requirement. You can't get the license without vaccinating your cat. Now, California as a state has required dog licensing since 1967. But like I said, it is still not required for cats. But there's something that we can do about it. ABC, American Bird Conservancy, has an action alert available now at this URL. If you'd like to send something to your state legislator to show your support for cat licensing, you can do so at this link. There are also other steps that you can take in your community to take action to support responsible cat ownership and effective cat management. You can demonstrate responsible cat ownership with any cat that you might own. You can take it out on a leash in a stroller. You can host it in a catio. You can have it outdoors in responsible ways. You can also educate your community about the impacts of cats in the environment and the solutions associated with cat management. You can become a bird city, which requires a city to enact certain regulations associated with a variety of bird conservation issues, but cats are one of them. You can also enact or support in your local area companion animal model ordinance. We have a fact sheet about that, which lays it all out. It's, you know, abandonment, sterilization, vaccination, and prohibiting running at large. So we're running out of time here. I want to say, you know, just in review, you know, cats can make wonderful pets. Like I said, I've got a cat. I've had cats basically my whole life, but they are a non-native invasive species when they roam in the environment. They have significant impacts on birds and other wildlife. They contribute to disease transmission, not just rabies, typhus, and toxoplasmosis, but a variety that I didn't even go into. And it is clear that removing cats from the landscape is the most effective, it's the cheapest, and it's the best way to manage domestic cats. We just have to work together to identify ways to achieve that, both through our own actions and also in community actions. And that's where we need your voice. Those who are educated on the impacts, who care about birds and other wildlife, care about natural areas, and who can promote responsible ordinances in your communities. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I hope you enjoyed the talk. And if we have time, I would be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Grant. What a great presentation. Powerful, I would say. Very compelling case. And I have been checking the chat, and normally that's how we do the questions. If anyone has questions, just post them in the chat, and then I can pass them along. If I think one thing that we would like is if you could maybe post a link to the video. I know the first one that you showed, you had a YouTube link. I'm not sure if the other two did, but the bandwidth here in Mendocino, I don't know which end of the deal it's on, but the videos weren't really working too well on my end of it anyway. So if you have a link that you can put in the chat, maybe that people can click on and
yes, I will do that. And I apologize for the videos. You know, I did look at them before we did this talk, and it was working just fine, but obviously didn't.
Yeah, they just, I've never seen one work on Zoom, really. Even if they play right on your computer, by the time they get through all the internet and get to somebody else's, it seems like they're pretty problematic. But I think people would like to go see those. So if we can get links to that, that'd be great. And I forgot to ask you at the start if you minded if we put this up on our YouTube channel, this the recording of this presentation, so that people. Yeah,
no, I don't mind at all. Please feel free.
Very good. We will do that. We'll have it on the Mendocino Coast Audubon YouTube channel, and you can probably get the links from that as well. All right. Are there any questions anybody has for Grant? All I see is excellent presentation. Thank you. Lots of fantastic information. Yeah, it really was. That was, I mean, this is a topic that I've paid a little bit of attention to, but I certainly learned a lot from you tonight. There was a lot of new information in there.
That's a good question from Bob about toxoplasmosis, pregnant women, and indoor cats. No, you don't really have to worry about that so much, Bob. So cats aren't born with toxoplasmosis or with the parasite Toxoplasma gondii. Cats actually don't really get the disease that much. They're frequently not really impacted by the parasite. But anyway, so they get it through predation of wildlife. And so if they're not eating eating raw animals, I guess we should say. So if you're feeding your cat a raw diet, it's possible it could become infected with toxoplasmosis or the Toxoplasma gondii. But if you're feeding it commercial, kibble or whatever, wet food, it's very unlikely. It should not be exposed to Toxoplasma gondii through its food, and therefore it is possible it could still get it because the oocyst could come in, through an open window potentially, or on the surface of something else. Maybe your dog goes out and rolls in some other cat's poop and then brings it in, and your cat somehow ingests the oocyst. It is possible, but it's far less likely. And so I wouldn't worry about it too much if you have a strictly indoor cat. And it also, I'll mention, it takes 2 to 5 days for the oocyst to become infective. So if you're changing your cat's litter box, every couple days, there's not a big exposure risk for you.
Interesting. Are you seeing the chat questions? There's one there about rodent control that I think is a common question on this topic. What effect would removing cats from the outdoors have on rodent? I think they mean on rodent populations.
Very little.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a common thought. I guess people, it goes back to the traditional way that we looked at cats as maybe as rodent control on a farm or something. And it just turns out they're really not very good rodent control, especially in urban environments. If you want to control rodents, you need to control the resources. So get rid of trash, get rid of denning sites. Cats are not the solution. There are plenty of videos online you can see of rats actually chasing cats, which are generally viewed as funny, but anyway. So yeah, cats, getting rid of cats is not going to have, in some instances, like an isolated island environment where there's some conversation about whether or not you should removing cats might allow for a rodent population to expand. But really, if you're going to control, again, I'm calling cats an invasive species, control one invasive species, you should control both invasive species at the same time to minimize any potential impact that might occur. And again, this is a very isolated environment, but generally speaking, no, none.
Yeah, I think that jives, with what I read. But it's not a widely understood message. I think that most people believe that cats are effective rodent controllers. I mean, I just hear this constantly. My cat keeps all the gophers out of my garden. My cat keeps all the rats out. And it just isn't true, but people believe it, and you cannot get them to not believe it. Once they believe that, then it's you're stuck with it. And so I think that's a real impediment to getting effective action taken on controlling outdoor cats, is people have beliefs about them that prevent them from accepting the whole idea that they have to remove them from the outdoors. Do you have anything to offer about that? Yeah,
there are a couple of studies that have found that the rodents, like urban rats, for example, there's a study from Baltimore which found, rats were eating side by side with cats when they're being fed in these feral cat colonies. That the cats would sometimes kill young rats, but generally wouldn't go after the adult rats because the adult rats are you know, they're vicious in their own right.
Big and tough and mean, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, it's a risk for cats. And then another study from New York City found that you didn't tend to see rats as much, but it's not because they weren't there. They just changed when they came out. And so there was no impact on the population.
Do you have some suggestions for how local Audubon chapters like ours can do public outreach without ostracizing and alienating cat owners? How do we talk about this in public without just polarizing people?
Yeah, well, I think you have to recognize the emotional impact that many people have with their pet. It's part of the reason I include the photo of me with my cat. You know, I'm not coming at this from a perspective of all cats are evil. It's, you know, not that at all. In fact, you know, my recommendations are in part motivated by a belief that we need to increase the level of care that we provide to cats to the same level that we do for dogs. And so I think coming at it with compassion and sympathy, and trying to help individuals understand the scope and scale of the impacts that a free roaming cat can have, and in particular the risks to the cat itself, because you know a cat owner is largely motivated by what's best for their pet cat. Certainly that is more personal to them, most likely, than what happens to a population of I don't know, any songbird or something. So if you can couch it in that sort of terminology, I think that can be a little more helpful. So things like sterilization, widely believed to be better for the individual cat. It also can reduce some of the nuisance behaviors for those cats. Vaccinations, clearly better for the cat, right? It's not as likely to get rabies or other vaccinations like feline leukemia virus or whatever the case may be. So, you know, that might be the way to approach it. And then, of course, different target audiences have different things they might be interested in. And so if you're talking to an MD, they might be more interested in the public health aspect as well.
Very good. And I think maybe we'll be in touch and get some of those resources that you've mentioned in your presentation. There was some good, I think, poster material in there, you know, the list of benefits to cats. That would be pretty helpful, I think. I think this is a pet project of mine. I'd like to have our chapter take this issue on, but it requires some pretty careful planning, and we need the right people to figure out how to do it. So thanks personally from me for this presentation, because I think this is a really, really important message.
Well, you're very welcome. And, you know, if there's anything I can do to be of assistance to the Mendocino Coast Audubon Society and or partners to help move things along, I would love to do that. This is, you know, it's clearly something that I think needs to happen. And I think we've shown that there are some opportunities for progress when it comes to cat control in the area. And so maybe we can start having those conversations about what that might look like and, you know, how that might be achieved.
Very good. Great. Well, I surprisingly don't see more questions. I kind of expected a lot more vigorous discussion, but I think most maybe we're hearing mostly from people that are already on board with your message.
Can you hear me, Tim?
Oh yeah, Doug, go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, I've been trying to enter a chat, but it won't seem to send. I don't know if I've got some blocker or something in my system, but I have the brochures from ABC, and I post them in the various post offices in the southern area, and when we start meeting in person, I'll bring some to the meetings for other people to put them up in post offices.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Doug. Yeah, Tara mentions she's not sure that the county animal control even takes feral cats, and that has become an increasingly big problem. Is that animal shelters They operate with a different mentality. You know, historically, they were concerned with public health, and that is not as frequently the case anymore. Maybe the government operated shelter might still have that mandate, but many of the other shelters and those that are contracted but are not necessarily a dedicated government operated shelter are now more focused on animal welfare. And that's good, you know, and there's nothing wrong with promoting animal welfare, but they are being driven towards what's called no kill, which is they have to achieve a 90% plus live release rate. So 90% or more of the animals that come into their shelter have to go out as adopted or released to another organization, cannot be euthanized, basically. And feral cats get euthanized at a higher rate than non-feral cats or than dogs. Cats in general are not recovered at as high a rate as dogs are. I think in part because people kick it out the door and just expect it will come home someday, and it may or may not. And so feral cats are not always even taken because of this high percentage of euthanasia. And so animal shelters are looking for ways to cook their books, essentially, by no longer serving that portion of the domestic animal population. I think it's a real injustice and a disservice to the community to no longer accept feral cats, because if they don't take them, you know, you're not leaving individuals who are suffering because of cats tearing up their gardens or killing the birds in their backyard, or maybe they have allergies, or, you know, they don't want to get toxoplasmosis or whatever the case may be. You're not giving them great options.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's where we are on the coast. The coast shelter closed years ago, and all there is the Humane Society. And is it open again? But I don't know who's actually collecting animals, you know, the feral animals.
Yeah, so, I know that I think feral cat colonies are authorized under county code, which is a shame. So essentially trap, neuter, release is authorized by the county, and that's not good. No,
it's not. Again, that's a problem, that people believe in a thing and then you can't convince them it isn't true.
Yeah, and we don't do that with dogs. You know, if it's such a great thing for the welfare of the cats or for population control, why don't we do it with dogs?
Yeah.
We don't, because it's not acceptable.
Yeah. Tough conversation. Because it requires, it seems to me that this can't be solved without some action by public agencies, right? We have to get the county and the cities on our side and get them to actually take unpopular actions. And boy, there's not much appetite for that in American politics at any level. So it's a tough hill to climb, but we got to try. I think we have to try to get something done.
You have to talk about it in the right way. You know, one way to talk about it would be you're defending private property rights by allowing for people to enjoy their property without having to be inundated by feral cats or neighbors' cats, you know, however you want to word the legislation. Because it shouldn't be your responsibility to keep your neighbor's cat or some feral cat that's maintained in a cat colony by somebody feeding it, you know, 3 streets over, to keep that off of your property when it's their responsibility. They're the ones really forcing you to take that action. It's a taking, essentially.
Mm-hmm. A lot to chew on and think about, and a lot to work on. Thank you very much. If there are no further questions, then I think we are probably done for the evening. I'm hearing applause from the other room in the house here. All right, thanks everybody. We will see you back here next month for the Tim and Dave show. Thanks again, Grant. That was really good.
My pleasure.
Really,
thank you.
yeah. Both good and important.